Everyone to CGHE seminar number 249. So nearly another milestone, 250. And we're looking at the triple century a little bit further down the track. Tom Brotherhood is with us today. We're really delighted to be hosting him. He's done a very interesting body of work on migration pathways of students and graduates in two contrasting countries, the UK and Japan. And that he'll be talking about his research, which has reached the stage of a doctoral thesis, which was passed without amendment. Tom is now an assistant professor at Rikkyo University in Tokyo, and his research is concerned with the relationship between internationalization of higher education and international migration. So the often not talked about, but quite influential and salient relationship between international education, especially longer term degrees, and migration and the potential, to transfer permanently to the country of education. That's his topic. Before I hand you to Tom, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Remember, as usual, the webinar is being recorded. It goes on to YouTube. The link to the YouTube site is on our CGHE website within 48 hours. And on the CGHE website, you'll find a transcript of today's chat function conversation as well. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you've been asked to speak when we're in the Q&A phase. And there's no need to have your video on either during the webinar, but we'd like you to turn it on when you're asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view, the command in the top right-hand corner with the big red arrow pointing to it, so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. Now, to ask a question or make a statement during the Q&A segment, we like you to put those in writing first in the chat, and we use that chat posting then as the basis for selecting you into the Q&A discussion. And when we reach the end of the presentation, we'll then have the Q&A, which usually runs for about half of the webinar. And I'll give you a warning if I'm going to ask you in. And if you come in early with your question in the chat, you can be pretty sure you will be asked in. When you're invited into the discussion, don't forget to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you can do that, and state your name and where you were from. So at this point, with thanks to Trevor, who does such a great job facilitating our webinars, let me hand over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that very, very kind introduction, as always. Can everyone see these slides okay? Does that look good, Simon? The slides look fine? Okay,
Yes.
I'll take it. I'll trust that they look good.
They do.
And say that today, yes, thank you all very much for coming first and foremost. It's really lovely to see quite a few familiar faces, or familiar names at least, even in this somewhat unfamiliar format. As Simon mentioned, I'm going to be introducing part of my doctoral research today that was carried out as a member of the Center for Global Higher Education. And today, although the main project, the whole project looked at student migration journeys in the UK and Japan, for reasons I will explain as we go through, I'm going to focus primarily on the Japanese portion of that research today. So the basic menu for today's presentation is first to have a brief look at student migration in Japan, what it kind of looks like, what is the picture of student migration in Japan generally, and look at some broader research on student migration internationally as well, to kind of feed into that a little bit and reveal my research interest, the reason for my interest in the role of agency in particular, the individual agency of these individual student migrants, and how that is activated and changes throughout their student migration journeys. I'll also do a little brief review of some narrative research methods and the particular methods I used in this study to create 4 narrative vignettes. These essentially small composite stories that are used to illustrate the different ways in which agency can be activated and dynamic while migrating through university. Now, today, what I'd like to do is kind of a nice hopefully engaging webinar style for you is I've actually got some of the international community at Rikkyo University to record those vignettes. So what I would like to do is sort of play those out for you today, and I will highlight some kind of key ideas and key quotations from those that will bring us through to our discussion and conclusions. So first of all, to kick this off, let's take a little look at international student mobility as a gateway to migration in different contexts. Now, I'm sure everyone who is taking part in this webinar will be very familiar with the growth of international student mobility over the past decades and the investments that governments have made to attract international students and the massive investments that individuals make in their international study experiences. But now we're also seeing, and there is a growing body of research around similar investments in student migration. Now, from the perspective of governments, this looks in some cases like enormous investments in marketing campaigns to attract international students with the promise of post-study opportunities. Now, this sometimes looks like, in a more tangible sense, new visa pathways for international graduates, whether that's to help them into the world of work, or whether it is just to give them the opportunity to stay and job hunt, even if they haven't yet been employed. In other contexts, it may look like preferential treatment for international graduates in immigration regimes. So this might look like shorter pathways to permanent residency for those who graduated from a university in that country. And in other contexts, it might look like expedited ways to get higher class visas or more secure visa statuses. Now, what this is really indicative of is what Shanti Robertson has spoken about a lot over the past 10 years, which is the education migration nexus. The idea that international education is now getting linked to international migration in a way that is particularly strong in certain contexts, but becoming more visible and perhaps more significant across the world. Indeed, a couple of years ago, Michelle Bass described the idea that international student mobility and migration have increasingly become entangled, even to the point where it appears both have merged. Now, this isn't necessarily the strength of that statement, I don't think is necessarily true in Japan, where I'm sure anyone who's familiar with it, Japanese higher education will know that there's been an enormous focus on internationalization for about 4 decades. There's been several different waves of internationalization, but generally the idea of internationalizing Japanese higher education as a system through the influx of international students and faculty members has been the general goal. But what we've seen, I would say, over the past 5 years, or maybe a little bit before, was you could see the earliest kind of embers of this starting, is that we've actually seen the arrival of a very receptive environment for student migration in Japan. First of all, this starts with very low barriers to entry to become an international student in the Japanese context. The eligibility requirements for a student visa are very low in international comparison. Secondly, we see that international students have quite extensive economic and social rights during study. This primarily takes the form of the ability to work to a large degree, though many people are able to completely support their studies and through part-time work. Although the Japanese government is kind of at pains to say that they shouldn't be doing that and they shouldn't be able to support it, many students are able to and do so. Moving on now to the kind of post-study arena, we see that there has recently been the introduction of what is called the designated activities visa, which sounds particularly vague, maybe for political reasons, but essentially what it's for is job hunting. You can graduate from a university in Japan, and even if you haven't yet found full-time work that could sponsor a work visa, you're able to stay in Japan for a period of around 2 years to essentially look for that kind of position. So you can continue working part-time to support yourself while looking for a job that will sponsor you to live in Japan long-term. Finally, we do see, as I mentioned before, some evidence of preferential treatment for international graduates of Japanese universities. On the one hand, they have access, particularly graduate students and doctoral students, have access to a highly skilled work visa, which has some of the best conditions of any visa in Japan, and gives them an expedited pathway towards permanent residency. So what we see here is, I believe, a receptive environment to student migration that we could conceive as a new kind of wave or stage of internationalization in Japanese higher education. And one way I think we can really drive this home is by realizing that international students are the largest group of foreign nationals in Japan who are candidates for long-term migration. So given this growing significance of student migration and the emergence of this receptive environment, it's a little bit of a shame that we don't yet have really much research on student migration in Japan, but perhaps it's inevitable given this is a relatively new phenomenon. But what we do have is a relatively large and quite significant body of research on international student migration internationally, particularly in the context of Australia, North America, Europe, and the UK. Now, what we see here is an immense amount of research on systemic factors that may influence student migration, particularly the administrative barriers that people may encounter and the cultural difficulties that people face when they're particularly entering the workforce. But what we have less of an understanding of is how the agency of individuals is significant in these processes. Tan and Hugo described that as a seldom explored aspect of student migration. And Tran and Vu recently said the notion of agency has not been the explicit focus of theoretical and empirical investigation. Now, there are a few studies that are emerging in the past couple of years that are essentially seeking to do this and answer this call. But we're still at the stage now where we don't have that much empirical evidence of how students navigate the myriad of systemic, cultural, and personal challenges of the education migration nexus. So that is ostensibly what this study was designed to do, was to look at the role and significance of agency in these student migration processes. But migration is a very challenging process to look at from a lens of agency, because it plays out over, in many cases, a number of years. And it's very difficult to engage at length with international students throughout that time. So even before they apply to be a student, throughout their study experience, and then in the post-study environment as well. So what you need first and foremost is a model of agency that is sort of sensitive to these temporal changes. And Emebayer and Misch in their caudal triad model of agency present one such a model. Now, what this model of agency purports to do is essentially break down agency as a concept into three constituent elements. Now, these three elements essentially look at the past, present, and future, respectively. Iteration here on the left is essentially the element of agency that describes how people draw on experience or precedent to guide their ideas and actions and desires. Now, one example might be that we're all familiar with the idea of following in others' footsteps. So that, I think, is one way of kind of illustrating in a relatively simple way the significance of iteration and precedent in affecting the way people act. Practical evaluation in the middle is the part of agency which takes place in the present. And what this essentially is, it's that process of making judgments about the social milieu in which you find yourself and the position that you see for yourself and the development of your identity within that position. It is the critical and evaluative element where you're basically saying, am I happy with where I am or not? What is my understanding of my position in the society right now? Finally, projection is the imaginative element of agency that looks towards the future. Now, I think, to give another brief example, the idea of where would I like to be in 5 years' time, and the answers to those questions and how that affects how we may act is a very quick and easy way to understand how projection functions as an element of agency. People look to the future and playfully imagine the different ways they could go, the different places they could end up in different timescales. And that has an immense impact on how people act in the present. So these three elements, which are a bit wordy, iteration, practical evaluation, and projection. So I'm going to do what Emebayer and Misch do and just refer to them as habit, judgment, and imagination, which is a little bit more, well, we could call it colloquial, but certainly it's easier for me to understand. And I spent 4 years studying this for my PhD. So The idea that habit, judgment, and imagination all play different roles in creating what we would call an overall agentive orientation. At certain times, I may be drawing heavily on habit and not so much on judgment and imagination. And therefore, my agentive orientation at that time would be broadly habitual. I would be drawing on precedent and drawing on what other people do to guide what I'm doing, what my actions. At other times, I may be thinking purely of the future and ignoring all precedent around me, ignoring what my parents are saying, and instead only looking forward to what I want to do in 10 years' time. And that might be guiding my thoughts, and I would have a broadly projective or imaginative agentive orientation. So what this model of agency allows us to do is to see individuals that participate in our research, to see their agentive orientation at a particular time, and if we engage with them longitudinally, to see how their agency would change over time, to see how these dominant or agentive orientations change over the course of time and whatever process or transition that they are going through in their life. Now, in this case, I chose to look at these very things through a method of narrative analysis. Generally, the data collection of my study was to speak with international students in their final year of study for a first interview, a very, very extended narrative interview in which students told me essentially all of what they found important about their biography to that point. So some people started with literally, I was born in this town at this day in 1996, and gave me immense detail all the way up to the present day when I was sat with them in that cafe. Other people didn't start that far and started right before they arrived in Japan. Whatever was important here was what they brought to the conversation. So I was able to get a full narrative of how they described the process by which they had arrived in Japan as an international student. Then, a period of 9 to 15 months later, after they had graduated, I then spoke to them a second time. Now, there was a narrative element to this interview as well, but also a semi-structured part where I would speak to them about the narrative they had given me 9 to 15 months previously in the first interview. And I would ask them to expand on these different ideas they presented to me. And that would sometimes give me some insight into where their ideas, where their priorities and where their desires had changed and where they had stayed the same. Now, having gathered all this data from, I believe it was 16 students in the Japanese context, I've then analyzed them to create these composite vignettes. Now, composite vignettes, so I can go into more detail about how these were created afterwards if you would like, but generally speaking, they are illustrative narratives that draw on the data from all participants. Okay, so I'm not just showing one person's narrative here, I'm drawing on the narratives of all participants and putting together a short illustration that condenses what I think is a good illustration, a strong illustration of how each of these elements of agency were represented in the narratives that students gave. But also it shows the significance that they had in these people's trajectories. It shows how their trajectories changed and were influenced by the different tools that this element of agency gave to them. So this is what I'm going to present to you today. One narrative that looks at habit in detail, another that looks at judgment in detail, another that looks at imagination, and finally, a mixed narrative, which generally speaking is more illustrative of what any one individual would be saying, where there is going to be a mixture of these things, where maybe there's an emphasis on habit at certain times and an emphasis on imagination at others. Okay, so these are the four I'm going to present to you today. And again, I would like to thank my 4 anonymous voice actors who've very kindly recorded these for us today. So I hope that will bring these to life. And as we go through, I will highlight some important quotations and we can discuss them all afterwards in a bit more detail. So moving on to these now, this is where I hope the technology is all working effectively. And if you can't hear this very soon, it should be apparent. Simon, just give me a shout and I will try to make sure it's all okay.
I don't remember exactly why I wanted to study abroad, but my parents had graduated overseas. I was also raised in a very bilingual environment, and all my classmates and peers came from very similar backgrounds. They were returnees. I think that has everything to do with my present trajectory. Growing up in that kind of household, studying abroad was a given, though I wasn't particularly interested personally. It's not really a matter of choice. It's just one of those things that you do, the successful route. Now that I've graduated, the reason why I returned home is that a lot of people around me follow the route. Study abroad, then go home. That's the overwhelming impression I have. Very few international students stay to work. So I returned to my home country and re-entered my old job in the same position, just regular life. I think this is normal. Anyway, I'm happy because I could receive a degree from a foreign country. People value that experience. I feel it's more valued if you've done different things in different countries rather than just doing one thing at home.
So I think this first narrative, you will have recognized that this is a real collection of quotations in which these individuals were referring to past experience, important others, shared understandings of what is appropriate conduct, and the power of social expectations in deciding people's trajectories. Past experience, we can see that in this quotation I've highlighted here in the reference to the bilingual environment that they were raised in, and the environment of classmates and peers who came from similar backgrounds as returnees, students, families who'd studied over abroad and then returned to, I believe in this case, it was Taiwan, and the influence that that had on their present trajectory as an international student who had come to Japan. In other quotations there, we saw the significance of important others, whether that be parents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, close friends, and the precedents that they offer, or the recommendations that they offer, and the significance that can have still in these international students who've traveled abroad and have gained that independence. That precedent still has an enormous amount of significance. Moving on now, I think that shared understandings of appropriate conduct, and particularly expectations of values that are held in society, had an enormous amount of influence on these international students too. So this quotation we can see at the end there, I'm happy because I could receive a degree from a foreign country and people value that experience. The idea that other people would value they have done this one thing. And in certain cases, we saw that people felt it would be more valued if they stayed in Japan, even if they didn't themselves necessarily want to do so. Again, shows the significance of drawing on past experience or precedent in influencing people's trajectories. Let's move on now to the second vignette.
Most of my learning here hasn't been through the program itself or my job, but rather through interactions with the Japanese society. When I was a student, I was just preparing myself for life post-study. I interpret it that way. My Japanese friends, they treat me differently now. They started saying that, now you're an adult, you have more responsibilities. I think I've been successful to an extent, but it's far from perfect. I have more personal responsibility, and I was able to get some financial independence, and I'm making a fist of living alone. But there's a particular culture, a particular set of rules that are difficult for me. I'm doing my best to come to terms with it, but some things I just can't comprehend. I guess a tricky part, now that I'm past the transition, is that now this is the evaluation period for seeing if Japan is a place where I could settle long term. Europe and America are countries that welcome migrants, but Japan is not a customer to migration issues. It's mostly composed of only Japanese people. I will always be a foreigner. I think that will not change in our lifetime. So, do I want to live here? I wouldn't say it directly. I think as a migrant, you want to feel welcome, that you are not invisible and that you have a voice of some sort in society, that you are acknowledged as part of the fabric of society. I got very mixed messages. I think Japan is getting to the point where it might have to slowly renegotiate how it positions itself vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But is it my battle to fight? There is a part of Japan that I don't like, but Japan is my second home. On the whole, I want to say that it has worked out. I came here to evaluate it, and we'll see. It's not like I'm already done. I can't just live in Japan. Every day is seeing something new, discovering something new. So it's still uncertain. I've committed to staying for 2 years, more or less. And if it doesn't work out, I will pivot out and maybe switch geographies again.
So in this second narrative, I think what this is illustrative of is these three things here. So first of all, I think this is a great indication of how the participants of this study had a great degree of reflexivity regarding their changing position in society. Now, the examples that I presented here is the idea that people recognize that when they changed in that transition from being a student to a worker in the host society, the expectations placed on them and the expectations they placed on themselves as a member of that society changed immensely. And this is just one example of many different ways in which they felt their relationship to the host country change as they went through their journey in Japan. Moving on, we saw great examples here of problematization. Now, problematization is a slightly theoretical term that Emma Bayer and Misch, the inventors of the causal triad, describe as the way in which people try to comprehend what challenge am I facing right now. Now, for this example here, we saw the example of somebody trying to come to terms with the fact that they didn't feel at home. They didn't feel at home. They didn't feel welcomed. And recognizing that that was a challenge that they were facing was preventing them from kind of committing and feeling comfortable in a future in Japan was the first step of them coming to terms with what situation they were in. Now, the second step of that is having recognized that problem was to characterize that problem and say, what does this challenge say? What does that problem say about the society that I'm in? And how does that affect the decisions that I'm going to make going forward? Now, you see this here in this bottom quotation here, where they're talking about the mixed messages they're getting from Japan, now, which on the one hand, seems like a place that is opening up to migrants and is offering opportunities, but on the other hand, was presenting these participants with innumerable barriers day to day that made staying more difficult and not necessarily something they wanted to commit to. Now let's move on a little bit quicker now. I know I'm spending too long explaining these, so let's listen now to imagination of the future.
I'm the type of person that's always planning, thinking of the future. Even in primary school, I dreamed of studying abroad. Then maybe from age 10 to 14, I started to like and then love Japan. So I started to plan how to come and study here. My dream was to come here. That was the first part. The second part was to live in Japan and stay living in Japan. So I made the plan A, plan B, plan C. I was preparing everything to go there and thought about the contingencies just in case. I applied 6 times for the scholarship. That specific scholarship was the best plan to guarantee that I could stay after graduating. So I just kept trying and trying. I chose to study here in Japan not only to change my life, but to have the opportunity to choose the things I really want in future. Also, in a sense, it was hypothesis testing to see if a life in Japan would be viable. It was a low-risk way to try it. If everything fails, rocks fall, I could go somewhere else. From now, it's really hard to say what will happen. I'm okay with adapting to life here, but I'm also keeping my options open. If I want to do a PhD in the Netherlands or Germany, it is possible. Maybe I can go to the US, maybe Australia, or something like Canada. Maybe Singapore. Actually, I want to go to London or England. It's a huge country and I want to learn how the global company grows there. In 10 years, I want to become at least the manager of a brand's office in London. Maybe after 25 years, I want to make my own company.
So in this narrative, we see a number of important things that came out. First of all is the evolving target of imagination. We hear a number of examples of people thinking back, even all the way back to primary school, about wanting to come to Japan and live in Japan. But for others, it was very much an incidental thing where an opportunity arose, sometimes after their graduation, where suddenly they had the opportunity to go to Japan and did so. But now, the big thing that came out in the interviews was how people's target of imagination, and particularly what was the kind of temporal boundary they were imagining, changed significantly as I was speaking to them. And was very different, the ways in which this changed for different participants. Some people were looking at the immediate post-study. What am I going to do the second my student visa expires? How am I going to negotiate that transition? And that was their real focus. Until the second interview, when I spoke to them again, suddenly they were thinking 25 years in the future, like that student we just heard from there. Another example we can see here is hypothesization, which again, that same student who, well, much as these vignettes are cobbled together from different participants, the one person they're talking about, the Netherlands, Singapore, maybe England, that was all one person. And that playful imagination, of possible futures is what we call hypothesization, where they're making hypotheses about where they could be if they were to follow a particular course of action. Finally, we see examples here of experiential enactment, which is essentially the idea that sometimes individuals engage in low risk, small investments in something that might be a longer term trajectory to just try it out and see if it's right for them. We see this in some cases where people chose to stay for just a short amount of time after their graduation to see if a life in Japan was for them. But other ways, we see it in a more comprehensive way, that the very idea of studying in Japan in the first place was a low risk to see whether living there long-term was the right thing. Finally, let's move on quickly now to the mixed vignette.
It would have been so different if I studied at a university at home. Just go to class every day. You don't really need to think about anything. Just follow the route like everyone is doing. But I don't necessarily go places just because I know people there. I don't try to just walk in others' footsteps. I prefer to do what I want to do instead of what people are telling me to do. That feeling got stronger after I came to Japan. I had wanted to be a civil servant because that's a stable job. But now, I want something more challenging where I can try different things. Once I got away from that discourse, that sense of what other people do, I was open to new ideas. Since coming to Japan, my whole sense of values, my view of the world has changed. I used to think, I just want to fly, and prioritized my freedom over everything. I didn't have any distant goals, but now I'm not satisfied with my life. I need to grow up. I started thinking more long-term. Before, I thought maybe 2 years ahead, but now I'm thinking 10, 15, 20 years in the future. It's a big change. After all, the world is just so damn huge. Of course, wherever I go, I will continue my relationship with Japan. Even as a student, A, I've been working, and B, I came with the intent of seeing whether or not this is a place where I want to stay. I was assessing it as a potential migrant. But I don't know what's going to happen in the future, so I'm going to do my best now to open as many options as I can, so I won't have any regrets in the future.
So eagle-eyed members of this webinar might have seen different examples of the concepts I've introduced so far. But I think what I really want to highlight here is first of all, this is a truer reflection of what any one individual's narrative would look like. So if I was to give you an extract from any one interview that I conducted, it would look more like this, with all the different elements of agency kind of mixed together, with certain times offering a certain agent of orientation as particularly strong, as the dominant orientation they're showing at that time. And what I really want to stress here is that this data that I collected showed that there was immense dynamism in these agentive orientations. People changed their way, the different elements of agency they were drawing on, and the different tools that immersion, the different ways in which they were trying to navigate the challenges they were facing changed dynamically over time immensely. First of all, it was just changing in response to the challenges they were facing and those changing challenges as they went from a student to a migrant, but also it was changing as a reflection of how their own goals and priorities were changing over time as well. So bringing all of this together, I think very quickly now, because I've gone a little bit over time, sorry, Simon, from the context of academic research, I think the things I would emphasize here is the evidence of dynamism of agency over time. These things change significantly for individuals as they go through this relatively protracted process of trying to migrate through a university, okay? And as this dynamism of its agency is evident, we see people drawing on different practical tools to help them get through this process. Now, from the perspective of an educational institution, I think it's very important that we understand that individuals' desires are dynamic and they change a lot. All of the evidence that I have seen published to date about how universities try to deal with these individual desires and how to support them through these processes of migrating through universities, they tend to collect data at one point, often at entry to the university, and use that to define how they are going to support these international students, or they use that to define how many international students are considering staying after they graduate. But we do have a little bit of emerging evidence from within Japan that students change massively, particularly in the first year of their studies, what they want to do post-study. So it's really important from a university that we're alert to this dynamism and that our support systems reflect this dynamism rather than ignoring it for administrative convenience. Now, finally, very quickly, I want to introduce the Future Project, which I intend to really focus on that aspect of it. What are these institutions doing? What are the universities doing to help international students and help international faculty members too, as they're trying to make their way from the world through these universities to a life in Japan? So the question I want to ask going forward is, how and to what effect have Japanese universities become migration intermediaries? I mentioned before that international students are the single largest group of migrants in Japan, and universities are playing an enormous role in that we do not yet understand, so we must look at that in more detail. Now, the very last thing I will say is that this research has been a very condensed version of something, as I scroll back through immensely quickly, maybe it's going like this, that will be published very soon in a upcoming CG book, Changing Higher Education in East Asia, that Simon and Shin have edited for us. And I would really recommend that you look at that book very soon when it's published in, I believe, February, but Simon will put me right on that. And there is a great number of fantastic contributions in that book that I've been lucky to read ahead of time as one of the authors. And I would really recommend that you that you should seek that out when you have the opportunity. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand back to Simon now.
And thank you, Tom. And let's go into the discussion. The chat is already beginning to fill up with questions coming from Monica and Sisanger, and also I think Chirito Pizarro is going to join it as well. But let me ask you a couple of things first. Perhaps a standard question almost about a doctoral study. It's an extended process of research. You have to conceive it from the ground up and then execute it. If you were starting tomorrow, knowing what you now know, is there anything you'd do differently? How would you make it a better study than the one you were able to do?
That list is very long, Simon, as you know, as the supervisor of the study. It's an interesting point, and I think in retrospect, one of the things I would do would be to focus on one country, because as you know, the dark alleyways of legal systems that administrate student migration in any country are so complex and so challenging that to get to the stage where we would have to compare those was, as you know, very time consuming. And much as I think we got to a place where we could understand what these students were going through in these two different countries, inevitably, there was an extra degree of obfuscation there, which I think made the ability to understand in the most detail possible what each individual student was going through a little bit more difficult. So I would say that from a kind of practical standpoint, a little more focus would have been very helpful, whether that would be on the UK or in Japan. I think it wasn't necessarily matter, but that's one thing I would say. A second thing I would say is that there would be so much value in speaking to participants before they start their degree, throughout the degree, and post-degree. I think that's where you're really going to understand how agency changes over time with a greater degree of sort of temporal acuity. I looked at 2 snapshots, the final year of study and basically within a year post-study, where I'm sure there was an enormous amount of change, but where that change had started was not something that I could capture. And exactly where had they come from? Of course, these students have an idea of where they came from and narrated that in an immense amount of detail, but there's a lot of research that we could discuss, and I'm happy to share with people about how the construction of narrative is not necessarily, that they were presenting to me, is not necessarily a completely accurate indication of what happened. So those are a few things that I would consider to do the study again, but I wouldn't change it for the world, Simon.
Well, it was a terrific study. I'm going to ask two more and put them together so for economy, because I think we've got a few coming in now. One is I've been reading Archer and working through the Archer discussion of, excuse me, reflexivity and the inner conversation that we have with ourselves, which I found very persuasive. In your study, I mean, you talked to quite a number of people on both pathways. Does reflexivity vary? Are there some people who are more inclined to reflect on their own lives and consider that remaking their lives in response to their reflections? Are some people more engaged with themselves in a kind of inner sense than others? I mean, Archer's work to some extent suggests this. What did you find in your study? And the other question I was going to ask you was, why Japan for the non-Japanese person? What's the compelling attraction? But people on migration pathways, sometimes there's push factors. They can't keep living where they are. They need to go somewhere else. Sometimes it's pull factors, the attraction of, the chance to make a better life for themselves, their families, maybe career opportunities play a role. What is it in relation to Japan that's particularly important for people?
These are fantastic questions. On the first one, my experience and my reading of the data was yes, that certain people would appear, according to the data, to be more reflexive than others. Now, there's two sort of caveats to that. Well, I say one explanation for that is kind of my hypothesis, and one caveat. So the pattern that I saw within that is that even if you look just within Japan, there's a great difference in the degree of reflexivity shown by those coming from the examples I would give are people coming from Taiwan, people coming from America, people coming from Europe, who perhaps I would hypothesize are more accustomed than people coming from certain other countries of expressing themselves in those terms and of considering themselves in that more reflexive framework in an open forum like an interview. The counterpoint to that would be the students that I spoke to from China, from Southeast Asia, who the impression I got from them were less comfortable sharing those kind of reflexive ideas when speaking to me. So that's probably partially because of my positionality, and partially because I think of some various cultural issues that I'm not an expert in, and cultural differences in the comfort and familiarity with expressing that level of reflexivity about the self. So that's what I would say on that point. It would be easy for me to say that my impression was that people from maybe American people are more familiar with speaking reflexivity about themselves than people from mainland China, but it's not that simple. There's a lot more going on there. But certainly in the data, it would appear, maybe from reticence to share that with me, that people from certain countries offered more reflexivity than others. On the second point, why Japan? So from the perspective of the students that I spoke to, I would tentatively break them down into three. There's basically three pathways that have brought these students to Japan in the first place. The first one was essentially privately financed international students from relatively wealthy backgrounds who were going to Japan sort of for the adventure of it. Sometimes they had a kind of cultural reason for going there. There was this particular aspect of Japanese culture that they really liked and wanted to indulge in, and that might take them to live in Japan long term or not. Who knows? It's just one thing to try and do. Then of the remaining two, they tended to be from East and Southeast Asia, and they tended to be coming on one of two forms of scholarship. The first of which is a mixed scholarship, which is essentially coming from the Japanese Department of Education, which is available to everyone and doesn't come with so many strings attached. It's kind of given out primarily on academic merit, and they are given the opportunity to come and study in Japan and possibly stay in Japan, and are even encouraged to stay in Japan. On the other hand, you saw people who were coming on a sponsorship from JICA, which is, I forget the acronym now, but is essentially engaged in overseas development assistance. And they are attracting students to come to Japan explicitly for a short period and explicitly with the legal requirement to return to their home country. So I spoke to a number of those students because they were students who were very keen on staying in Japan and were trying to find a way to get around that legal requirement to leave. And we're trying to find a way to either stay for PhD or to enroll in another course of study, or basically find a way to cheat the system to stay. Now, those three groups of people had come to Japan for very different reasons, but had all, for one reason or another, found themselves seeking to stay. So I think there are many reasons to go to Japan, and perhaps that's something that we could be researched in a lot more detail as well, particularly how the requirements around sponsorships change their expectations for migration post-study. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Tom. Interesting answers, and and you've covered a lot of ground already, I think. Now, I'm going to bring people in groups because we don't have an enormous amount of time, and it would be good to get more voices in the webinar. So, Tom, keep a record of the questions as they come through, because you'll need to answer them together. The first one is from Monica Jaswal Oliver. Monica. There she is.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Thomas, for such a wonderful topic. I am first year research student myself, so this is very much in line with what I am. My topic is I'm researching on economic impact post graduation and using the gender perspective lens. So. On that note, my question to you is, like it states, are the institutions that international students are enrolled in Japan, do they have support, like career center or also, international office of guiding them through, post-graduation? Thank you.
Okay, that's our first question. And the second question is from C. Sanger.
Oh, yes. Thanks. At the policy level, does ISM relate at all to the problem of an aging population in Japan?
Okay, Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much. Two excellent questions. I'll start with Monica. First, best of luck in your research journey. First year of a research student is an exciting time, so I really hope you'll enjoy it a lot. In response to your question about student support and institutional career services to help these students find jobs in Japan, from the research that I did, that was very patchy. So certain institutions had nothing at all. Some institutions were essentially drawing on the career services that are there for the Japanese students, who are the vast majority, and had maybe one person, or there was one contact or two contacts who were trying to help out, but that wasn't really their main job. And there was one institution, which obviously I can't name, but had a very highly developed career service for international students and was very, very successful in placing them. And I went and spoke as part of the research that isn't in the thesis, because I went and spoke to the people who were doing that, and that's something I'll perhaps draw on in future. So within the institutions, it's very patchy. Now, there is also an organization that's a governmental organization called JASO, which is essentially an organization there to help international student affairs generally. And one thing that they have developed now is a proto-career service for international students, which primarily takes the form of literature, like publications that people can use to help them. But also, I think there is a degree of one-to-one feedback that they can give and help. It's patchy, it's early days, but I think there is sort of the foundation of what could be a useful system to support these students. Yeah, I think I covered that one. Now, Sanga, at a policy level, does ISM relate at all to the problem of an aging population? Yes. So one important aspect of that is that the immense effort that Japan has gone into attracting international students to come to Japanese universities, part of that is due to the aging population and demographic decline within universities, which has meant that the 18-year-old population, people who would be entering universities, has decreased a lot. And particularly the private sector of Japanese higher education, which is very, very big, has had a problem with maintaining enrollments. So to a degree, the attraction of international students in greater numbers is alleviating that problem. It's also, there's also the wider issue around caring for the aging population. So there's a number of programs in Japan that are bringing in, particularly from Southeast Asia, students to come and study nursing and social care, and they will stay for a number of years to work in that sector in Japan before returning to their home country. So that's another way in which Japan has set up kind of pathways through international student mobility to deal with the aging population in Japan. So that's two ways I can think of. I'm sure there's more that I'm forgetting, but yeah, that's two that are coming to mind now.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks to our questioners. Now I'm going to test your brilliant replies a little further by bringing in 4 people. So the first one will be Chirito Pizarro, and then we'll follow with Yana New, Seong Lee, and Ikram Toomey, all of whom have had, or most of whom have had something to say already in the chat. So Chirito, can we bring you in, please?
Yes, hello, everybody. I'm from the Philippines. Thank you very much, Thomas. That was very incisive. It was condensed, but quite reflective of my situation. Well, it gave me an instance to compare the Philippine situation and Japan, because when I came from abroad, I encountered the ambivalence of my people. Like, for example, a foreign degree is supposed to be highly esteemed, but internally there was this resistance to people from coming from outside, so to speak. So that was a problem that I found in one of your vignettes, the second vignette. Okay, so as I said, this was actually reflective of my own culture here. What the person in the second vignette encountered, the mixed messages. Thank you very much. That's all.
Next is Yana New.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for your excellent presentation. I'm from UCL Institute of Education. I have 2 general questions. And the first one is the student migration one of the main trends in the internationalization of higher education in Japan? And my second question is, could you please share with us the 3 main trends in the internationalization of the HE in Japan? Thank you.
So there you are, Tom. You are now a quantitative researcher. You've got 3 main trends to deal with. Don't forget those first 2 questions. And next we have Seong Lee.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. And yes, your analysis process by using this vignette was particularly interesting to me. So I think it is a very effective way of analyzing how students practice their agency. But my question is, what do you think would be some aspects of agency or practical tool of agency, as you said, that cannot be captured or difficult to be captured by using this vignette, including activity? Thank you.
That's a challenging question, that one, isn't it? Finally, Ikram Toomey, who has a question which I think many of us would like to hear the answer to. Ikram.
Hi, everybody. I'm an assistant professor in Kent State University, and my journey actually began as an international student in Texas. So I related to a lot of what you were discussing and talking about. My question was whether you encountered in your study any difference between students who come from the global south and students from northern countries, because we all know there are a lot of issues of privileges and nationality privileges when it comes to movement and migrations. And I was wondering if that affect how students from these two places see their future and their migration journey and the possibility for their futures. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Okay, Tom, so there's 4 different sets of themes for you to respond to.
Thank you, everyone, for wonderful questions. I think we only have 4 minutes, so I'll try to get through them all.
We do sometimes go over the hour, as people know, so you can get away with whatever you need to answer the question.
Careful, Simon. Another 100,000 words coming your way. Right. So, Charito, thank you very much for your question. So, the ambivalence of people towards people from overseas, I think this was certainly something that was described by a number of participants. And I think it kind of is, it was a little bit hard to summarize exactly what ambivalence they were feeling, because I think it was a little bit different for different people based on perhaps some of the things that Ikram has drawn upon there. But certainly there was a sense of feeling that we are not entirely welcome, and perhaps you weren't being entirely appreciated for the skills that you had demonstrated in your degree when entering the workforce. Now, I think that is partially to do with these pathways are relatively new. And as there's a lot of research to attest to, institutions in Japan, and that includes private companies, and particularly the large private companies that a lot of these students would like to work for, are relatively slow to change. There is a commitment to changing, a sort of a verbal commitment to changing and internationalizing and becoming more global and drawing on different resources from overseas to modernize, but an internal resistance. The way it's been described really well by, I believe was it Robert Aspinall, who calls it dynamism without risk. They're happy to change so long as there is no risk involved. And hiring international students represents a risk for many of these people. So even though there will be some of these people graduated from excellent universities within Japan, from which Japanese graduates would be highly valued, there was an extra degree of ambivalence or concern or distrust of international students who found themselves being rejected for these positions. Yes, mixed messages throughout, I think. Yanan Yu, excellent question. So this is a challenging one. So first of all, is student migration one of the main trends in the internationalization of HE in Japan? I would argue yes. So my reason for that is, like I said, it is the largest single population of international people in Japan. It's the largest single visa category in Japan of people who may be able to stay long term. So I think in that regard, it's an immensely significant trend within Japanese internationalization. But I would also say that it's kind of by accident to a large degree. And although there's been a few recent policy changes to increase these options, from the perspective of internationalization and universities, I don't think that they are particularly aware of the significance of the role they are playing. And it certainly isn't a big part of the internationalization strategy of institutions in almost any case that I can bring to mind. Only one I can think that they are genuinely drawing on. We have this excellent post-study job hunting support program, and that is how we will attract students. There's only one institution I can think of that's doing that. Now, your second question, what are the 3 top trends of internationalization in Japan? Very hard question. The 3 that I would say I would bring to mind are still the attraction of more and more international students and the attraction of more and more international faculty members. Now, I know there's people in the room who have researched these things. So I think that they are kind of old hat, but still within Japan, within the policy documents they are publishing, they are huge, absolutely huge. And within that second one about attracting international faculty is international collaboration, and attracting people who can publish in internationally recognized journals is a big thing for Japanese internationalization. The third part I would say is EMI in various forms. English medium of instruction courses are growing across Japan, and there is an appetite for increasing them further, both to teach Japanese students and to teach international students from overseas who don't have ability in Japanese. So I think English medium instruction is huge in the Japanese context. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. I'm going to kick myself later. There's something more important than those, but they seem to me, from my research, from my reading, and from living and working here, as three very crucial things. Now, moving on, So-young. It's a difficult question to answer. What would not be captured using this vignette format? I think one of the issues here is that because this is the format of analysis I did, and what I've missed is not necessarily immediately apparent to me, but I'm absolutely certain there is things. This is something I need to think of in more detail. So I will think on this and make a note, and I'll respond to you by email, because I think I need to do justice to this question more than I can do right now at midnight. So I'll come back to you by email if that's okay, So-young, because it's too good a question.
Good.
And Ikram, finally, thank you very much for your kind words. Yes, so this is kind of one of the issues I was touching on before, and that the communicative strategy, the communicative styles of people from the northern, global north and global south was a little bit different. And it was hard for me to parse whether that is just a communicative difference or whether their experience of living in these countries was very different. For example, people from the global north tended to be far more critical of Japan and were willing to be openly critical of Japan. And the effect that Japan was having on them and the discrimination that they felt. That was far less the case with people from the global south, who on the whole were far more complimentary of the situation they were in. And even if some of them were going through really quite difficult things, being sent home when they didn't want to, when their family was settled in Japan now and their children were going to Japanese schools and their partners had got jobs working in Japan as well, and they were being forced to go home, they still didn't see that as a reason to be particularly critical, or at least not to express that in a form of critique to me. So that is something that was very different. Now, another interesting kind of counterpoint to this is that there was a degree of people who were described situations in which they were able to pass as Japanese in job hunting to a degree, not to a, obviously not, they wouldn't if under any form, extensive form of analysis or investigation, but they were able to pass as Japanese in their job hunting process to a high enough degree that they were able to kind of get jobs or use that to help them get jobs, help them get through networking situations and things like that without it being revealed. There's a word in Japanese, like bareta, like where it would be accidentally revealed that they were not actually Japanese. That was something that people from, generally speaking, the global south, people that were able to pass as Japanese in that way because their language skills tended to be much better. So that was a kind of interesting side point that I noticed. Yeah, and of course it overlaps with the different types of sponsorships too. Those that were overseas development assistants tended to be from the global south, and they were running into those barriers more than those from the global north. So many factors I could speak about there, but I'll have to stop there, I think, because Simon's given me the
Thanks, Tom. And thank you for your careful answers to all four of our questioners. I thought they were great questions and gave you plenty to work with. But you've done really well for us today, as our presenters have been doing consistently week by week. We're very fortunate in our program in the quality of the presentations and the discussion that we're having. Let me, deeply thank you for your engagement and the depth and thoughtfulness of your answers. In closing, I want to acknowledge Hiroko Hashimoto, my former doctoral student from Monash, who's been in this webinar, and good to see your name here, Hiroko, and hopefully we'll be able to bring you into discussion at some point in future. The question I asked you, Tom, was, why do people want to be in Japan, come to Japan, live in Japan? And I have an answer to that myself, I think, and there is something very special about Japan. It's distinctive. It's an extraordinarily well-developed society in some ways, and it does something so very, very well that the rest of us are only groping towards. And there's a consciousness and awareness of itself, which is also profound. I mean, I think, different parts of the world, they engage us intellectually, they engage us, effectively when we spend time, we begin to adjust and become part of them. But Japan, in my experience, engages us, in the level of the soul, the ontological level, quite fundamental. And you would find yourself becoming a different kind of person in Japan. As a result of that, if you spent some time in Japan, like I did in 2009 for 4 months, you leave again and you leave a bit of yourself behind, and you always miss it. So having you on today talking about migration pathways into Japan made me think about the life I'm not having, which is the life of living in Japan. It has that compelling effect, but perhaps it's not the only part of the world which does that to us. Next webinar, next Tuesday, we touch base with Hamish Coates and colleagues at Tsinghua University Institute of Education. Hamish and colleagues are going to talk about the transformation of Tsinghua during the pandemic period, the way Tsinghua developed prototypes for online higher education, which have then become prototypes for the country as a whole, in this extraordinary way China has of developing things centrally and testing them everywhere, and then refining them and improving them, and having devised a sort of new national system. But it's also good to touch base with Tsinghua, because, I mean, if Chinese universities, as my colleague Bill Kirby from Harvard said at a webinar in Netherlands last week, Chinese universities are going to become, in the 21st century, what the US university has been in the 20th century, that is a kind of the leading place for educational practice worldwide, then Tsinghua will be the Harvard, this extraordinary university which makes every post a winner, which does everything so well, which is so well led. So it'll be good to have the opportunity to talk with the colleagues from Tsinghua about what they're doing. And we look forward to seeing you then. Once again, thanks very, very much, Tom. And we look forward to seeing you again in the webinar program. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.